So we're going to go ahead now and look at 1, 4. We're going to try to finish it up today. And we're going to begin with zero factor. And I hope that everyone is kind of familiar with zero factor, but if not, we're going to go over that. Okay, so let's talk about how zero factor is going to work to solve these equations in 1, 4. So here's how zero factor works. What we need to do for zero factor is step 1, you set your equation to 0. Step number 2 is you factor. And step number 3, what we'll do after step number 3 is we'll set each factor equal to 0 and solve. So that's going to be our directions in how we use zero factor. A little bit different than the square root property. But what we do for zero factor, and you're probably familiar with this from previous courses, is we have to set our quadratic equal to 0, our nonlinear equation to 0. We factor it, and then we solve it. Very important that we know how to factor. So we're going to pick out several questions from our textbook to work through and just remind ourselves how to use zero factor. So we'll start on page 139, and we're going to begin with question 14. So what we have is we've got x squared plus 2x minus 8 equaling 0 here. We're going to take a moment to talk about how we would solve this. Now, first off, this is nonlinear, right? Why is it nonlinear? It's nonlinear because of the x squared. If it was linear, we could just solve it directly, right? But this is nonlinear. It's a quadratic, and it's got a square in it. So what we first need to do is we're going to apply zero factor, and we need to make sure it's set to 0. Has it already been set to 0? Yes. If it's not been set to 0, then we make it equal to 0. In this case, it's already set to 0. Now, what we do is if there's no number in front of the x squared, we're going to put a 1 here. And then we take the first number and we multiply it by the last number. So 1 times a negative 8. 1 times a negative 8 is a negative 8. So that goes in a box over here. And every instructor teaches factoring a little bit differently. I have you factor by grouping, is how I do it. Some instructors use it where you check the factors. I do factor by grouping. So I take the first times the last, and that gives me a negative 8. Now, we need to remember how the signs work. The negative 8 in the box, it's negative. So what does that mean? That means that one number is positive, one number is negative. Why? Because we want two numbers that multiply together to give you a negative 8. And how can we get a negative number when we multiply? Well, the only way that that can happen is one positive, right, and one negative. Now, what we need to do is we need to find two numbers, one positive, one negative, that multiply together to give you a negative 8 and subtract from each other to give you 2, positive 2. So when we look in the middle, look at the sign in the middle. What's the sign in the middle? It's positive. So my larger number is positive, smaller number is negative. What two numbers can multiply together to give you that negative 8, subtract from each other to give you 2? I'll kind of give you a hint. I'll kind of work this one out for you. How about 4 and negative 2? Does that work? Right? Why is that going to work for us? Well, to check it, 4 times a negative 2 is what? Negative 8. And 4 minus 2 is what? 2 in the middle. Now, because of the 1, we can jump directly to our factors. So this now will factor into, and we'll talk about some where we have to do grouping later on. But we're going to start with some simpler ones where we can jump to our factors. Because this is a 1 here, and we had to put the 1 there, we can jump to our factors. Now, what are our two numbers? Okay, x plus 4 and x what? Minus 2. Now, we're going to get usually at most 2 solutions. Sometimes you may only get 1 because they may be the same. And we're going to do a lot of these. So we've got it factored. So we set it to 0. Ours was set to 0 already. We factored it. And now we set each factor to 0. So that means we take the x plus 4 equals 0. And we move our 4 over. And that leaves us then with our first solution, which is x equals a negative 4. What about the other one? X minus 2 equals 0. So we add our 2. And we get now, for our second solution, x equals what? Positive 2. And everyone teaches factoring a little bit differently. I like to put the number in the box and then figure it out. Now, why did we have one number positive, one number negative? Because the sign in the middle was negative. And we need two numbers to multiply together to give you a negative. Well, the only way that can happen is one being a positive, one being negative. Then I looked in the middle. The 2x was in the middle and it was positive, so my larger number is positive, and that means the smaller one has to be negative. And we're going to do a lot of these, and they'll get easier after we work through more of them. Okay, now that one we could just jump to our factors on. Question 15 is a little bit different. Well, we just did, that was 14. Let's go back and do another one, an easier one. Let's go back and do 13. Okay, this one, the 8 was negative, one number was positive, one number was negative. Let's go back and do another easier one. Let's go back and do 13. It's the same type of question. X squared minus 5x plus 6 equals 0. So it's going to be done the same way the last one was done. If there's no number in front of the x squared, we put a 1. And then we always take the first number times the last number. So the 1 goes in front, and then 1 times 6 is a 6. So that goes over here. Now, since this is positive, they're either both positive or both numbers are negative. Now we look in this sign in the middle. What's the sign in the middle? Sign in the middle is negative. So that means both of these numbers are negative. Now, what do we need? Okay, we need two numbers that multiply together to give me a positive 6. Add together in this case, because they're the same signs, to give me a negative 5. So what two numbers would add together to give you 5, multiply together to give you 6? Okay, and in this case, since the middle is negative, we're going to use a negative 3 and a negative 2. And I always write the larger number on top. That way we don't have to worry about the signs. Now, if there's a 1 out in front, if we had to add a 1, then this is an easier question. We can jump to our factors. And what would our factors now be? Well, our factors would be x minus 3 and x minus 2. Is everyone okay with that so far? Now, what are our two answers going to be? A lot of times I see students say the answers are negative 3 and negative 2, and that's not correct. We need to set them to 0 and solve them. So x minus 3 equals 0. So that gives you one solution, which is x equals 3. X minus 2 equals 0, and that gives you the other solution, which is x equaling now what? Positive 2. So there are your two solutions for that question. Now, if there's a number out in front, then it becomes a little bit more of a challenge to work through, because then we have to do factor by grouping. So the first two we did were pretty easy. We could jump directly to our factors. But for question 15, we're going to have to do more work. Okay, so for question 15, I'm going to write it here, we're going to have to set it to 0, and then we're going to have to factor by grouping. So question 15 is 5x squared minus 3x equals 2. So what's our procedure? Let's go back and remind ourselves about zero factor. Okay, it's called zero factor, so that means we start by setting this equal to what? Equal to 0, right? So whenever it's a quadratic, set it equal to 0. So move that 2 over. So that leaves me now with 5x squared minus 3x minus 2 equals 0. Is everyone okay with that so far? Okay, so first step is always make sure it's equal to 0. Now once we have done that, now what do? Now we take the first number times the last number. Before it was just a 1, but now it's a little bit more difficult because it's a 5. So 1 times a negative 2, well, 1 times a negative 2 is a what? Negative 10. And since this is negative, what does that tell me? Since it's negative, that tells you that one number is positive, one number is negative, because this is negative here. That's the important part. So that's negative. Now, what do we know about the middle? What's the sign in the middle? Negative. So that means the larger number is going to be negative. Smaller number is positive. What two numbers now multiply together to give you 10, subtract from each other to give you 3? 5 and 2. All right, now the 5 is going to go first, and it's negative because the sign in the middle. So we need a 5 and a 2, right? And we can check, because if we wanted to check, negative 5 times 2 is negative 10, and minus 5 plus 2 is what? Negative 3, and see how it matches in the middle. Now, on this one, because of the 5, we cannot just jump directly to our answer. So what we do is we split the middle up, and we factor by grouping. So we split that negative 3 up. We keep the first number and the last number the same. So we've got a 5x squared and a minus 2 over here. That stays the same. What about the minus 3? We can break the minus 3x up into a minus 5x and a positive 2x, right? It's our factors here. We split that up. Now, why did we do that? We did that so we can factor it by grouping. And I think this is one of the easiest way to do these type of questions is factor by grouping. And we group our first two pieces together. And look at what I've got underlined there. What can I factor out of the first two pieces? What do those two have in common? They have a 5 and an x, so that's going to come out. So 5x comes out. All right, and what's going to be left over? Okay, well, 5 divided by 5 is gone. X squared, we took 1 out, so that leaves you with an x and a what? Negative 5 divided by 5. That leaves you with a negative 1, right? Okay, is everyone okay with that so far? So we took the 5x out, and that left you with an x minus 1. Now we look at the next two pieces. What can come out of the next two pieces here? Okay, positive 2. And what's going to be left over? X minus 1. It better be the same. These groupings had better be the same. If they're not, you made a mistake. So now we know these are the same, so that can come out. So now we have an x minus 5 out in front. And what's left over? 5x plus 2. And that still equals 0. Now we've got it, and now it looks like what we just did a moment ago. We got our factors. Right? It's already set to 0. Now we do our last step, which is set each part to 0 and finish it. So now we're going to set each piece to 0. So we've got x minus 1 equals 0. So one solution now, so it's not so crooked here, is x equals 1. Right? Move it over. Watch your signs and be careful with that. So x equals 1, that's one of the solutions. What about the other one? How do we get the other one? What is it? It's going to be 5x plus 2 equals 0. Move the 2 over. So 5x equals negative 2. Divide by your 5. And now we've got x equaling what? Negative 2 fifths. And there's your 2 solutions. And you can also do this by guessing the factors. I prefer a more mechanical way of factor by grouping. But if you factored a different way, that's fine. However you might have learned to factor before, if you want to continue factoring the same way, you can do that. I'm just showing you one way to solve these. That was 15. Let's do some more of these. How about question 17? Minus 4x squared plus x equals now a negative 3. So, what do? It says, directions say, solve this with 0 factor, right? So 0 factor means this must be set equal to what now? 0. So that's our first step, is always make sure it's equal to 0. So add that 3 over and rewrite. So now we have a minus 4x squared. We have a positive x and a plus 3, and that equals now 0. So move that 3 over. To make it easier, we never ever want the x squared part to be negative. You'll be doing this also when you work with the quadratic formula. It begins with a negative 4x. So what we want to do is we want to make sure it's positive, so I'm going to go through and divide everything by a negative 1. That's going to switch all of your signs out, and that's going to make sure that our x squared stays positive. So if it starts with a negative, divide everything by a negative 1, which switches your signs, and that makes it a 4x squared minus x minus 3. You can do it without switching the signs, but it's more confusing with the factors. So what I always do is I always divide by a negative 1 if it begins with a negative. And you'll use the same concept with the quadratic formula. You need to make sure you especially do that when you work here in a moment with the quadratic formula. But 0 factor, we're going to approach it the same. If it begins with a negative, you divide everything by a negative. And then we look and we make sure we can't factor anything out. And we can't on these. We have a 4 and a 3. They have nothing in common. So what do? We take the first number and we multiply it by the last number. And we put it in the box. So 4 times a negative 3. Well, what's 4 times a negative 3? Negative 12. What do we know about the 12? 12 is negative. So what do we know about our signs here? Okay, 1 positive, 1 negative. Which one's going to be the larger number? Is it positive or negative? Negative one's going to be larger. Why? Because the middle's negative. What two numbers multiply together to give me 12 subtract from each other to give you 1. I think someone said it 4 and what? 4 and 3, right? So we're going to use a minus 4 and a positive 3. Because minus 4 times 3 is a minus 12. And minus 4 plus 3, what is that? Minus 1, which matches in the middle. Now we proceed to the next step, which is where we split the middle up. So this is going to get split up. And what do we split it up into? Well, we're going to split this up into 4x squared stays the same. Minus 3 stays there as well. But this minus x, well, that splits up into a minus 4x and a positive 3x, just like that. We split that middle up, and we do that because now we factor it by grouping. And we group the first two together, and we see what's in common and what we can factor out. What can we factor out of here? It looks like we can factor out, what can someone tell me? 4 and an x. All right, and that leaves you then with an x minus what? 4's came out, x minus 1. Next two pieces, what can come out? 3, right? Because these have a 3 in common, so we factor that 3 out. Now we know that we are doing it correctly because that leaves you with an x minus 1, and these match up. They have to match up. If these groupings are different, you made a mistake or it's not factorable. So those were the same. So now we're going to rewrite this as x minus 1 out in front. Okay, gone and gone. And what's left over? That's simply 4x plus 3. Now, what are my two answers going to be? What do? We set each part to 0 again, don't we? So let's do that. So x minus 1 equals 0. That gives you one solution, which is positive 1. And the other one is 4x plus 3 equals 0. Move that 3 over. So 4x equals a negative 3. Divide by your 4. And x now equals a negative 3/4. So there are your two finished solutions. Okay. Is everyone kind of okay with how we did that? Let's do another zero factor. Zero factor is very, very important. We use it a lot. That's why we're going to spend some time working on it. Someone have a question? Uh-huh. Yes, these are our two answers here. Okay, and this is what we started with. So what did we do? First thing we did was we set it to 0. Okay, so we set it to 0. So move that 3 over. Okay, so there's the top of it. So we set that to 0. And we divided everything by a negative 1. Yep, and I'll move it. Yep, I'll move it down here. That way you can see the rest of it there. And remember, you can always look on Canvas too and see the notes. So always put the notes on Canvas. If you look in your Canvas course, and you look in your modules, you'll see the notes from last week and this week too. Hey, you're welcome. Yep, you can always see those and the video too. I always record the video. So anything that you miss, you can go online and look in Canvas. That way you don't have to try to stress to copy everything down. So if you miss something, you can always go back in Canvas and look in the notes in your module, and you'll see it. I try to put it up right after class. That way you can print it out if you need to, or just look at it. Okay, so is everyone all right with that so far? Let's try another one of these. Question number 18. Let's look at 18. So question 18 here. Question 18, we've got a minus 6x squared plus 7x equals, again, a negative 10. So it's very similar to the last one. What's the first thing that we need to do? First thing that we need to do is add that 10 to make it equal to 0. So we'll do that. And then once we've done that, then you are correct. Once you've done that, it begins with a negative. Now we don't want it to begin with a negative, so we divide everything by a 1. Negative 1. That switches your signs. And now we can rewrite this as 6x squared minus 7x minus 10x, minus 10, sorry about that, equals 0. This one's got a little bit larger numbers, so we're going to talk about how we would handle the larger numbers. When we multiply, we have 6 times a negative 10. 6 times that negative 10, well, that is a negative 60. And what do we know about our signs? Are they going to be different, or are they going to be the same now? They're going to be different, right? Why are they going to be different signs? Because this is negative, so that means that 1 is positive, 1 is negative. And again, why is that? Because that's a negative there. Then we look in our middle. What's the sign in the middle? Negative. So that means the larger one's negative, smaller one's positive. Now, how do we find the factors? Well, the other ones were really easy to factor. This one's more of a challenge. So let's see how we'd factor this one out. So what we do is we divide until we find the factors that'll work. Now, when I look at this, what does it end in? It ends in a 0. All right, so if your number ends in a 0, it's either going to have a multiple of 5 or a multiple of 10 in it. And we need 2 numbers that are going to multiply together to give you that 60, subtract from each other to give you 7. So let's start with a 5, because it ends in a 0, so it has to have a 5 in there. And 60 divided by 5, that's a 12. Now, what about 12 and 7? What's 12 minus 7? 12 minus that 5 there. Let me say it correctly. 12 minus that 5, that's a what? 7, isn't it? And isn't that what we need? Yep. So how about we use a negative 12 and a positive 7? Sometimes it may be a little bit more difficult to find the factors. And I'm going to give you one in a moment that's a little bit more difficult. This one was pretty easy, though. It ended with a 0. If it ends in a 0 or a 5, you're going to want to try multiples of 5 or 10. If it ends in a 0, or just 5 if it ends in a 5. And you'll eventually find it. Now, once you've gotten to this point, what do we need to do? Well, it begins with that 6, so we can't just jump to our factors. So what's our next step going to be? We split up that middle. And we keep the 6x squared over here, and we keep the minus 10. And what does that minus 7 split up into? A minus 12x and a positive 5x. Now we do it again by grouping. So now we group the first 2 together. And what can we factor out of the first 2? Can someone tell me? What number and variable would come out? 6x. Okay. And if I factor out a 6x, then what's left over? Yep, x minus 2. So there's that piece. Next 2 pieces, what needs to come out of here? Next 2 pieces, we need to factor out what? Okay, someone set it at 5, right? And that should match up with this x minus 2. If I factor a 5 out of here, that does leave you with an x minus 2, doesn't it? Are these groupings now the same? Yes. If these were different, you made a mistake. These are the same, though, so we know we did it correctly. And what do? We write the x minus 2 out in front. And what's left over? 6x plus 5. Okay, Okay, and now we've got it factored. Is everyone okay with that so far? And again, there's different ways of factoring. If you're comfortable guessing the factors, you can do that too. I like this way, it's more mechanical. And with larger numbers, it's easier. So now we need to get our two solutions. Okay, so we've got it factored. So what would our two solutions look like? Let's set these to 0. So x minus 2 equals 0. One solution now is x equals what? 2, like it should be. The other one is 6x plus 5 equals 0. Move that 5 over. So 6x equals a negative 5. Divide by your 6. And now we have x equaling a negative 5/6. I want to create a more difficult one to factor here. So the next one I'm going to give you, I'm trying to give you something with larger numbers. Let's see. I'll start with something. How about we try to solve this one? Again, solve with 0 factor. So I'm going to make up a new one for us to look at. Let's see, how about a plus 12 here? And we'll make this one equal to 0, and I'll get the middle for you. Okay. How about we make a plus 19? X in the middle. Okay, so this is going to work for us here. We're going to try again to factor this one out. Make sure it works, and it does. So it's equal to 0 already. So what do we do first? We take the first number and multiply it by what? Last number. So 4 times 12, what is that going to be? 4 times 12, well, that is a 48. Let's talk about the signs. Tell me, are the signs the same or are the signs going to be different? That's where we always begin. What do we know about the signs? Same or different? The same. Why are they going to be the same? Because it's 48 and it's positive. And how can you get a positive number? Either double positives or both negatives, right? Because negative and negative also makes it positive. Then we look in the middle. And what's our sign in the middle? Positive. So that tells me they are the same. So since this is positive, that tells you they are both now going to be positive. They're either going to be both positive or both negative. In our case, the sign in the middle is going to dictate what the sign's going to be, and it's positive. Now, where do we begin? We've got this 48. Okay, 48 is an even number. What we always do is start small. So 48 is an even number, so let's try 2. 2 and 24. Well, 2 plus 24 is 26. Does that work? Nope. So then we slowly move our way up. Always start with small numbers. If it's even, you divide by 2. If it's odd, you might try 3, you might try 7. Odd numbers are a little bit more difficult, but even numbers begin by taking 2. Odd numbers, try other odd numbers like 3, maybe 7. If it ends in a 5, you try multiples of 5. If it ends in a 0, you try 5s and 10s. So that did not work with the 2, so we move up. So let's try a 3. Does 3 work? Okay, 3 is 3 and 16. Well, what do we want? 19. What's 3 plus 16? 19. So what are our two numbers going to now be? 16 and 3. Now we've got them. Now we finish it. So we break that 19 up. So we keep the ends the same. So 4x squared stays the same. 12x stays, or sorry, the 12 stays the same there. And what do we break 19 up into? 16x and a 3x. So we take 3 terms and we break it into 4. And then once we have it into 4 terms, we factor by grouping. So we group the first 2 together, and what can come out of here? Looks like we can take out a what? 4 and a x. Okay, so that's going to now leave me with an x plus what? What's going to be left here? X plus 4, right? Right. Where did I get the 4 from? Well, 16 divided by 4 is what? 4. So there's that piece. What about the next 2 pieces? Can someone tell me what to factor out from here? The 3 and the 12, what do they have in common? These have a 3 in common, don't they? And what's going to be left over? If we divide out, it should be x plus 12. Where did that come from? 3 divided by 3 is 1. Leaves the x there. 12 divided by 3 is what? 4. So that's where that 4 came from. Are my groupings the same? Yes. So now we can rewrite this as x plus 4, bless you, and 4x plus 3. Now, if you can guess the factors, you can do that too. A lot of times students can guess those factors pretty quickly. Other students struggle, and that's why, like this way, it's more mechanical. You see the same procedure every time. So you're not just guessing factors, you're actually working out mechanically. So now, what are my 2 solutions going to be? We've got x plus 4 equals 0. So x equals now negative 4. Move that 4 over. What's the other one? It's 4x plus 3 equals 0. Move that 3 over, so 4x equals a negative 3. Divide by your 4, and so x now equals a negative 3/4. That's it. Just kind of making sense how these work. So now we have talked about 2 of the 3 concepts in 1-4. So we have talked about zero factor, which we did today. We did the square root property last class period. The only one that we have left, and the most difficult one, is the quadratic formula. And it's not really difficult. It's just time consuming. And you have to be careful with your signs and careful with squaring and order of operations. So now we're going to move on and we're going to look at the quadratic formula. And the quadratic formula can solve any of these. Now, zero factor is usually going to be faster if you can zero factor. But in many cases, there are problems that you cannot use the zero factor on because it will not factor. So then we're forced to use what's called the quadratic formula. Now, to use the quadratic formula, it must be set to 0. So just like zero factor, it has to be set to 0, and it needs to look like this. It must look like ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. So that's what it needs to look like. So to use the quadratic formula, it needs to resemble this. Now, our quadratic formula is just a formula. And the quadratic formula is x equals minus b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 AC all over 2a. And you're probably familiar with this, or probably at least have seen it before. And this is called your quadratic formula. You don't have to memorize the quadratic formula because you can write it in your notes for your exam. So I don't make you memorize things. You need to know how to use it, though. That's the important part, is that you can use it. So when we start, it needs to look like this, just like it's going into zero factor. So you set it up just like it's going into zero factor, and then this is our quadratic formula. Now we can use this to solve things that will not factor. And we're going to start with one that won't factor. So we're going to solve with the quadratic formula. About 5x squared minus 8x equals 12. So we're going to try and solve this with the quadratic formula. So we've decided what method we're going to use. We're going to use the quadratic formula. And to use the quadratic formula, it needs to be set to 0. So that's our first step, is move that 12 over. And make sure it's set to 0. So it is. Once it's been set to 0, then we look and we make sure it starts off positive, which it does. And then we look at our numbers, and we need to make sure that nothing comes out. A 5, an 8, and a 12, well, they have nothing in common. Okay? If that had been, let's say, if this would have been, let's say this was a 5, this was a 10, and that was a 15, we could take a 5 out, right? But in this case, nothing's in common. And the next one I'll create, you'll have something in common, and you'll factor it out first. But 5, 8, and 12 have nothing in common. Now, we need to make sure that it's in the correct order. So it needs to look like this. Is it in the correct order? X squared, x, and then the number. Yep, it is, right? Okay. Now, what do we need to do from here? Okay, well, we need to label our A, our B, and our C. So we take a moment to label our A, our B, and our C. All right, so A, what's our A going to be? Number in front, A is a 5. B is a negative 8, and C is now what? Negative 12. So take your time. Where students make mistakes on these is you get in a hurry. So make sure you take your time and do not rush through things. So we've got our A, our B, and our C. And where are the mistakes normally at? Well, they're in the signs. So we always make sure you take your time. When I was grading your homework, I also looked at that, and a lot of you made this mistakes of signs. You know how to solve these. You just have to take your time. So don't ever rush through things. You'll spend more time fixing mistakes than you would have just done it right the first time. So take your time. If you need to use a calculator, use a calculator. So now that we have it labeled A, B, and C, I always like to rewrite the formula just for reference. So there's our formula. X equals minus B plus or minus the square root of B squared minus 4AC all over 2A. Now I plug in my numbers. Be careful with that B because you've got to change the sign on it. So when I rewrite this, always take your time and use the parentheses for that negative there. So we need a negative B, so that's a negative of a negative 8. And then we've got our plus or minus b squared, well, that is negative 8 squared. All right, and then we've got a minus 4. A, which is, in this case, 5. C, which is a negative 12. And that's all over 2a. Or, sorry, 2 times 5 in this case. My mistake. 2 times 5. Is everyone okay with that so far? Now, how we work on this one is we want to clean it up a bit, and we're going to work with the discriminant by itself. And the discriminant is simply what's underneath the root. So I'm going to rewrite this. Draw a line here so it's easier. This is going to be my work on the left in this case. So we're going to go ahead and clean this up a bit. Let's work with our signs here. The double negative on that 8 is going to make that now what? Positive. We'll have plus or minus. We're going to leave the square root. We'll work with it over to the side on the left. And now we've got 2 times 5 down below, which is a 10. The discriminant is what's underneath the root. So if you see that word discriminant or hear that term discriminant, that just means what is underneath that root. And that is what is under the root. So what is underneath our root? Negative 8 squared minus 4 times 5 times a negative 12. Here's where students make mistakes with the signs. When we square a negative 8, what does it become? A positive or a negative 64? Positive 64, right? Because we have parentheses around the negative. When you square a negative number, it becomes a positive. Now let's get the signs on the next piece. A negative times a negative on the second part makes that now a what? Positive there. And now we just multiply. The way I work these out is I figure out my sign first. Negative and negative makes it positive. And then I just use my calculator to multiply. 4 times 5 times 12, well, that gives you now the 240. So that's that 240. Now we can add these together. And 64 and 240. That comes out to be 304. And that goes underneath our root. Is everyone okay with that so far? Now, we need to make sure that we can't break down that 304, because you might be able to. Now, when I look at 304, it ends in a 4, so it might have a 2 in common. Let's see if a 4 goes in there. I know a 2 will. I think a 4 will. So now we need to make sure we break this down, if possible. So now we're going to break up that 304. Okay, 304, it's an even number. It has a 2 in it. Let's try a 4. So 4 went in there. And that's 4 and 76. Does 4 go in there again? Yes, because that's 4 and what? 19. And does 19 break down any further? No. We want to break up this square root. So the 4s are going to come out. So we now have 8 plus or minus. Now we've got a 4. We've got the square root of 19. And that is over 10. Is everyone okay with how I got to this step? Is everyone okay with that so far? Now, we need to see if we can break it down. A lot of times we can break this down, and let's see what we can do. When we look at the 8, the 4, and the 10, do they have something in common? Yes, what I normally do is I rewrite it so it's easier to break down. So I'm going to rewrite this as 8 over 10, and then we've got plus or minus 4, square root of 19 over 10. And what about 8 over 10? What does 8 over 10 reduce down into? Okay, 4 over 5, someone said it. So that reduces down to be a 4 over 5. And what about the 4 and the 10 here? Can those reduce? Yep, that's going to leave you with a 2. Square root of 19. And what about that 10 over 2? That leaves you with a 5. And are these denominators the same? Yep, so put it back together into 1. If it was an I, you'd keep them separate. If it's a real number, though, you put them back together. And that gives you 4 plus or minus 2 square root of 19 over 5. And that's going to be your final, finished answer. Where students struggle sometimes is just with the square root. So let's go back and review it. So we see how we got that 304. And then we need to make sure we break up this 304. So what I do is it's an even, so I try 2 and then I try 4. 4 worked because 4 is a perfect square. So I took the 4 out, 4 is 76, and then 4 and 19. 4s are paired up. Remember we did this in 1, 3. So we took the 4 out. What's left over? The 19. Now we split this up like we did in 1, 3 when we worked with those complex numbers in standard form. And we split them up. Okay. 8 over 10 reduces down to a 4 over 5. That 4 and 10, well, that can reduce down to be a 2 and a 5 there. These have the same denominators, so I put it back together. You can reduce it without breaking it up. I like to break it up. I think it's easier to see that way when you do the 2 separate fractions. So I usually break them up and then put it back together. And there's your answer. So you actually have 2 solutions because of the plus or minus. Now, one thing we do not want to use in the quadratic formula is we do not want to use fractions. If you've got fractions, get rid of them. So if you have a problem that has any fractions in it, and you're trying to use the quadratic formula, you've got to get rid of those fractions first. Never, ever try to put fractions in a quadratic formula. It's going to be very difficult and hard to do, so clear them out. And that's a 14 there. So let's make sure you see that's a 14. So here's what we want to do. We want to solve this one with the quadratic formula. Now, never, ever put fractions in the quadratic formula. It's not going to work out nice. You want to get rid of it. So when I look at this, I want to get rid of my fractions. Now, what am I going to have to multiply this entire quadratic by to get rid of my fractions? Let's look and see what we've got. My denominators. What are my denominators? 7 and what? 14. And the least common denominator, if we looked at it like that, of 7 and 14 is 14, right? So we're going to have to multiply everything now by what? 14. That'll get rid of all of it. So multiply it all by that 14. How do we clear our fractions? Divide by the number down below, multiply by the number on the top. So 14 divided by 7. What's 14 divided by 7? 2. Okay, so 14 divided by 7 is 2, times 4 makes it an 8x squared. 14 divided by 14 is a 1. Multiply that by 1. That leaves you with a single x there. And don't forget the last piece. 14 times a negative 1. Well, that is a what? Negative 14. Let's try to Let's try to keep it a little bit quieter so we can focus on what we're doing here. So we cleared out our fractions, right? We multiplied everything by a 14. Now we've gotten to this point. We're going to try to use our quadratic. Is it set up for the quadratic formula? Is it set to 0? Yes. Is it in the correct order? Yes. So let's label our A, our B, and our C. If there's no number in front of the X, you can put a 1 there, just so you see what it is. You don't have to, but right now we're just learning, so I'm going to put that there. Now we have our A, which is 8, our B, which is 1, and our C, which is a negative 14. So that's where we're at so far. Now, I always like to write the formula. I think that's a good habit to get into. That way you've got it. So you don't have to worry about looking it up. And once you write out the quadratic formula enough, you'll have it memorized anyways. But you don't have to memorize it for your exam. You just need to know how to use it. So I like to always write it up. So X equals minus B plus or minus the square root of B squared minus 4AC all over 2A. So is everyone all right with what we're working with so far? Yeah, let's try to keep the side conversations down a little bit. I don't mind if you whisper to each other, that's fine. But just make sure that everyone can still listen to what we're doing here. So we've got it labeled, right? We need to go ahead and put our pieces in. Be careful with your signs. So negative B, so that's going to be a minus 1, plus or minus. And we've got the square root of 1 squared minus 4 times A, which is 8, times C, which is a negative 14, all over 2 times 8 there. So we plugged our numbers in. And once we've gotten to this step, now we're going to take our time. First thing I like to do, we don't have any double negatives, so that negative 1 will just come down. 2 times 8, that makes it a 16. We'll leave the plus or minus in the square root. Over on the left, we're going to work with our discriminant. And that's 1 squared minus 4 times 8 times that negative 14. Let me slow down a bit so we can get caught up here. So is everyone okay with what we did so far? So let's review what we did. First thing we did was we multiplied everything by what? We multiplied it by 14. That cleared our fractions out, didn't it? Then we made sure it was set to 0. If it's not equal to 0, move things over so that it is. Then we labeled our A, our B, and our C. We wrote up our quadratic formula and plugged the pieces in. Now let's try our discriminant. Okay, be very, very careful with the signs. If there's a mistake, it will probably be in the signs, in the discriminant. So 1 squared is 1. Negative and negative makes that positive. So that's what I do, is I determine my signs. That way we don't have to plug it in our calculator with negative, so we know that's going to be positive, because negative and negative here makes that positive. And then we just multiply 4 times 8 times 14. So that's 448. And we add those together, and that gives you 449. Now, we need to see if we can break down that 449. And we may or may not be able to break it down. We're going to see what we can do. Now, 449, that ends in a 9, so it probably has a 3 in it. Let's see if a 3 goes in there. And it doesn't. I don't think 449 is going to break down at all, because 3 doesn't go in there. I don't believe 7 goes in there either. Yeah, nothing's going to go in there, is it? I don't believe 449 will break down at all, because 3 won't go in there, 7 won't go in there, 9 won't, 5 won't, 11 won't. There's no number that's going to work. 15 won't, 13 won't. Yep. So, can we break this down at all? Nope. 1 and 16 have nothing in common, so that's not going to break down. So this would be your final answer there. Okay? Because you can split it up and try to reduce it, but there's nothing to reduce with that 16 below. And that 449 is not a perfect square, and it's not going to break down. Let's try another one. I'll move this up so we can get that copy down if we need to. Let's try another one here. We're probably going to do 3 or 4 more of these. About 8 equals negative 4x minus 2 over x squared. Okay, so another one with fractions, and we're going to try and solve this one. Okay, don't make this one harder than what it needs to be. We look at our denominators. What do we have in the denominator? In the bottom half of these fractions, what's in there? An x, right? Now we need to make sure we get rid of all the x's. So to get rid of all the x's, we need to multiply everything by what? Not just x. What's our largest one? X squared. So we're going to have to multiply everything now by x squared. And then we can distribute through. So take your time and distribute that x squared through. So now that gives me 8x squared equals x squared and an x cancel, leaves you with a minus 4x. X squared and x squared cancel, that leaves you with a negative 2. So all I did was multiply it all by x squared. And this is very, very similar to question 15 in your homework. It'll do the exact same procedure, different numbers. So if you look at your homework, question 15, all we have to do is multiply it all by what? X squared, right? It's the same. Different numbers, but similar type of question. Now, what do we need to do from here? We're going to be using the quadratic formula, so we need to set this equal to what now? 0. So I'm going to add my 4x over, and your 2. And I picked this one on purpose because we're going to be able to reduce the numbers down in a moment. When I rewrite this, we have a 4x squared plus 4x plus 2 equals 0. We could work with this the way it is, but we would have to reduce it at the end. Now, before we use the quadratic formula or 0 factor, once it's been set to 0, I compare all 3 of these numbers. I've got an 8, a 4, and a 2. What number's in common with an 8, a 4, and a 2? They're all divisible by what? 2. Okay? If there's a number in common, you want to divide it out at the beginning. It's going to make your life a lot easier. It's easier to do it at the beginning than at the end. So I'm now going to divide everything by a 2 to reduce it down. Now the numbers are smaller and easier to work with. So I divided it all by 2. 8 divided by 2, well, that leaves you with a 4x squared. 4 divided by 2, that leaves you with a 2x. 2 divided by 2 is a 1. And 0 divided by any number is a 0. Now the numbers are smaller, and now they're easier to work with. So always check first to see if there's a number in common. Like if this would have been a 9, a 6, and a 3, you could divide everything by a 3. Right? In this case, we could divide it all by what? 2. So always check that. It's going to make your life easier in the long run. Now, once it's set to 0, we label. A, in this case, is 4. Right? B is a 2, and C is a 1. Write up your quadratic formula. So rewriting that, we've got x equals now a minus b plus or minus square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So take your time and write it. Now, I always like to write the formula, that way I can see it, and it makes more sense where the pieces go. It takes a bit of time, but I always like to write that formula down first. That way I know what I'm working with. I've got my pieces labeled. I'm going to plug them in, and I'm going to finish this question out. So now what does it become? Okay. Negative b, so that's a negative 2. And then we've got our plus or minus. We've got the square root now of 2 squared minus 4a, which is 4, c, which is 1, all over 2 times 4. And I picked this one out specifically for several reasons. First off, you had to divide by the 2, so that made you reduce it. This one is also going to give us a non-real answer. So this is the first one that's going to give us a non-real answer. And so I wanted to make sure that we know how to write our non-real answer at the end. Non-real meaning we're going to end up with an imaginary part. So I take my time and I rewrite. So we've got a minus 2. We've got a plus or minus. That square root will stay there. And 2 times 4, that makes it an 8 down below. On the left-hand side, I'm going to work with my discriminant. And that's simply what is underneath your root. So what's underneath your root is called your discriminant. And that's 2 squared minus 4 times 1. 2 squared is 4. A single negative keeps this negative. So that second piece is going to be negative, right? 1 negative makes it negative. And 4 times 4 is 16. 4 minus 16 is a negative 12. Slow down to make sure we see how that works. This one's actually easier to break up than some of the others. Now, why is this one going to be non-real? Why is there going to be an I involved? Because there's a negative underneath the square root, right? So we need to make sure that comes out as an I, and we're also going to break up our 12. Remember, we learned how to do this last class period in 1-3. So let's go ahead now and break up our 12 and then take out the imaginary part. So 12 breaks down into 4 and 3, which is then what? 2 and 2. So the 2's come out. So what's this going to break up into? Well, it's going to break up into minus 2 plus or minus. It's negative here. So that means a 2 comes out with an I. The I comes out because of the negative. What's left over? 3 over 8. we need to split this up, and we need to reduce it. So split it up into the individual fractions. So we can then reduce. And negative 2 over 8, well, that leaves you then with a negative 1/4. So there's your real part. Then we've got our plus or minus. 2 and the 8 can cancel. That leaves you then with the square root of 3 over 4 when you reduce. And we'll just put the I at the end. Put the I in front of the square root, or you can put it at the end. Either way is perfectly fine. But that would be your final answer there. And I did make these multiple choice so you could see how to get the correct answer, how to write it correctly to make it look like theirs. And I usually with these split them up into the real part and the imaginary part. And you can put the I in the front or the I behind. It doesn't matter. We're going to look at one more of these using the quadratic formula. So I'm going to go ahead and pass out the sign-in sheet before I forget. I do have your homework up here. So when we finish this question, this will be the last one. It's going to take a bit to go through. But before you leave, you can pick up your homework. You can turn it in last time. If you didn't turn it in, you could turn it in today. So please make sure you sign the sign-in sheet here. We're going to finish out one more question, and then we'll talk quickly about the homework. So I want you to solve this one. So this is what I want you to solve here. And I only gave you one of these in your homework. And we're going to solve this with the quadratic formula. Now the first thing we need to remember is when we're solving things, we need to get rid of all these parentheses so we can eventually get it to 0. Now, how do we get rid of these parentheses? Well, I know it may have been a while since you used the FOIL method, but we're going to have to FOIL out the left-hand side. So we're going to work on the left-hand side with the FOIL method. Now, how do we use our FOIL method? Let's take our time to FOIL this out. Okay, when we do our FOIL method, we take the first times the first. And we're going to use this technique a lot in 1-5 when we have these applications. So we're going to go ahead and multiply x times x. That makes it an x squared. Outside times outside. Well, that's here. So that's x times the 4. That makes it a 4x. Negative 7 times x makes it a negative 7. X here. And then last times last, that makes that now a negative 28. And let's make this a negative 4x. So that way it doesn't cancel out. Bless you. Sorry about that. I don't want it to cancel, so let's make that a negative 4x there. Sorry about that. That way it doesn't cancel out with the other one. So make that a negative 4x there. Otherwise it would cancel, and I don't want to do that. So now we need to clean this up. So we're going to combine those together. And that is now x squared minus 3x minus 28. And that'll be a negative 4x. So make sure you make that a negative 4x. I could have left it as a negative 3x, but it would cancel, and I don't want to do that. So just make that a minus 4x there. Okay, so we FOILed it out. Now what do? We've gotten rid of the parentheses, so now we need to set this equal to what now? this needs to be set equal to 0, doesn't it? Okay, so add your 4x over. And that leaves you with x squared. And we have a positive x minus 28 equals 0. Okay, and we're going to use the quadratic formula again. If there's no number in front of the x squared and the x, you use a 1. So our pieces are A is 1, B is 1, and C is a negative 28. So we've got our pieces labeled. So there's your A, your B, and your C. They've been labeled. Now we're going to proceed to finish this out. So we write up our quadratic formula. So x equals a minus b plus or minus the square root again of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Plug our values in. So that's a minus 1 plus or minus the square root of 1 squared minus 4 times 1 times a minus 28 over 2 times 1. So we're taking our time here. And we're going to finish just right on time. So set that to 0. We've got our A, B, and our C labeled. Now we're going to work with it. We're going to use our discriminant. Over here, we're going to break this up first, so that's minus 1 plus or minus, got our square root left over, and 2 times 1 is a 2. On the left-hand side, let's try our discriminant. And what do we have on our discriminant? We've got 1 squared minus 4 times 1 times a negative 28. So that's 1 squared is 1. 2 negatives makes it a, watch your signs here, negative and negative makes it now a positive. That's where students make the mistake most of the time is with that. And 28 times that 4, 28 times 4, that's 112. Add those together and we get 113. We're almost finished here. We're going to finish right on time, a little bit early actually. 113 I don't believe is going to break down at all. Because 3 won't go in there, nothing else will go into 113. Okay, 113 is not going to break down. 1 and 2 have nothing in common. So this would be your final finished answer. Because 113 will not break down. So what's going to be due for our homework? What's going to be due on Tuesday? Tuesday. Your homework is going to be 1.3. You can do all of those now. And 1.4. You can do all of them as well. So you can do all of that homework packet. If you've got questions, we'll go over it again on Tuesday. If you haven't turned in your homework, make sure I get that today.